He was an award-winning poet and playwright, an educator, a controversial social and civil rights activist, a felon who had served more than 7 years in prison for nonviolent protests, and a lifelong objector to what he called American military imperialism. He was also a Catholic priest, a Jesuit, and surprisingly, a former military chaplain. And he was so much more. Born in Minnesota in 1921 and raised in upstate New York, Daniel Berrigan's mother was second-generation German and his father second-generation Irish. They ran a small farm. Berrigan joined the Jesuits directly out of high school in 1939 and was ordained to the priesthood in 1952. He was assigned to teach theology at the Jesuit Brooklyn Preparatory School, and later he was appointed professor of New Testament studies at Le Moyne College in Syracuse, New York. That same year, he won the Lamont Prize for his book of poems, Time Without Number. In 1965, he and his brother Philip marched with Dr. King in Selma, Alabama. From 1966 to 1970, he was part of an organization at Cornell University in Ithaca, which brought together all religious groups on campus. It was during this period that he played an instrumental role in the national peace movement. In 1968, at the height of the Vietnam War, Daniel Berrigan made a controversial trip to North Vietnam with historian Howard Zinn. They met with Vietnamese officials and were able to bring home 3 American prisoners of war. The American government was not pleased. Later that year, Berrigan made national headlines. His brother Philip, a Josephite priest, had been arrested a year earlier for protesting both the draft and the Vietnam War by pouring blood on draft files in Baltimore. Now Dan and Phil and 7 others would burn draft files in Catonsville, Maryland. In an interview, he said, "I was teaching at Cornell, and my brother Philip came up. He was awaiting sentencing for prior actions in 1967 in Baltimore, where they poured their blood on draft files in the city. And he came up to Cornell and announced to me very coolly that he and others were going to do it again. I was blown away by the courage and effrontery, really, of my brother. Not really just submitting to the prior conviction, but saying, we've got to underscore the first action with another one. And he says to me, you're invited."
But the idea of putting myself into the furnace of the king, or being thrown there, was pretty shocking and new. So I told Philip, give me a few days to think this over and pray over it, and I'll let you know. So I did. I went through some very serious soul searching and talked to my family, and couldn't see, I will put it negatively, I couldn't see any reason not to do it. I didn't want to do it, but I couldn't not do it.
By the time the Catonsville 9 action happened, they switched from blood to fire.
The Catonsville 9, as they came to be called, manufactured homemade napalm. The 9 protesters, including Christian brother David Durst, used it to destroy 378 draft files in the parking lot of the Catonsville, Maryland Draft Board on May 17, 1968. The Berrigans were promptly arrested and Father Dan sentenced to 3 years in prison. Instead, he went into hiding for 4 months. The FBI apprehended him at the residence of William Stringfellow, an Episcopal theologian who made his home on Block Island off the coast of Rhode Island. Berrigan was sent to prison for 4 years. He was released in 1972. According to actor Tim Robbins, a friend of the Berrigans, They had been for years working various causes, writing congressmen, meeting with judges, meeting with government officials, trying to go the route of what everyone tells you, You shouldn't do civil disobedience, they say. Why? Why don't you just write a letter? Well, they had been for years and years and years, and they had been doing as much as they could to bring attention to the war in Vietnam. But what they realized is that they had to break the law in order to bring out the larger moral issues into the public forum. Berrigan later traveled to France to meet with Thich Nhat Hanh, the exiled Buddhist monk and peace activist from Vietnam. In 1980, Berrigan, his brother Philip, and 6 others began the Plowshares movement. They illegally trespassed onto the General Electric nuclear missile facility in King of Prussia, Pennsylvania, where they damaged nuclear warhead cones and poured blood onto documents and files. They were arrested and charged with over 10 different felony and misdemeanor counts. In 1990, after years of appeals, Berrigan's Plowshares 8 group was resentenced and paroled in consideration of time already served in prison. This legal battle was recreated in the 1982 film In the King of Prussia. Near the end of his life, Berrigan commented that he had been arrested for nonviolent protest more times than he could count, but not as often as he should have been. He spent over 7 years of his life in prison for standing against violence and every other form of injustice. Daniel Berrigan remained involved with the Plowshares movement to his final days. In his declining years, he made his home in the Jesuit community at Fordham in the Bronx, taught at the university, and volunteered at a local clinic for people suffering with HIV/AIDS. Even into his 90s, Father Berrigan continued to maintain a level of activism, including protests against American intervention in Central America, the 1991 Gulf War, the Kosovo War, the U.S. invasion of Afghanistan, and the 2003 invasion of Iraq. Father Berrigan remained a prominent pro-life activist who frequently spoke out against abortion and capital punishment, and he also worked in support of lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transgender rights. He continued to write and publish, and was a contributing editor of Sojourners magazine. Father Daniel Berrigan has been described many ways: gentle poet, determined activist, holy priest, inspired teacher, but perhaps the most accurate description is the most obvious. He was one of the great prophets of our time.